What would you do if the two people you trusted most, the two pillars of your life, betrayed you in a way so unimaginable that it shattered everything you believed in? This is not the plot of a novel or a Hollywood thriller. It is the true account of a suburban family in the United States, a family that seemed ordinary to everyone looking in from the outside. To neighbors, they were the kind of people who waved politely across white fences, showed up to school events with smiles, and embodied the perfect picture of stability. But behind the front door of their spacious home, a secret was festering, a secret that would ultimately erupt in tragedy. The woman at the center of this story is Emily Parker, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher living in Denver, Colorado. She was the kind of woman her students adored, known for her patience, her gentle encouragement, and her ability to make learning feel like a game. Outside the classroom, Emily was just as dedicated, pouring every ounce of herself into raising her two children, Ethan, aged 8, and Chloe, who had just turned 5. To Emily, these children were not only her greatest joy but also the meaning of her life. She often told friends that being their mother was her proudest accomplishment. Her husband, Michael Parker, was 38 years old, a successful attorney working at one of the city's respected law firms. He specialized in corporate litigation, a field that demanded long hours, sharp wit, and relentless determination. Michael was the type of man who always seemed composed, pressed suits, calm voice, and a confident smile that suggested he had everything under control. To outsiders, he was the quintessential family man, a husband who provided, a father who occasionally showed up at Little League games, and a professional whose career trajectory was pointed only upward. Completing this family circle was Linda Hayes, Emily's mother. Linda had moved to Denver a few years earlier after retiring from her job in another state. She wanted to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren, and Emily welcomed her presence with open arms. Linda was more than just a mother to Emily, she was her confidant, her sounding board, and often her closest friend. The two spoke daily, sharing not only the challenges of raising children and juggling work but also intimate feelings about relationships and personal struggles. Emily trusted Linda completely, perhaps more than anyone else in her life. From the outside, the Parker family's life unfolded like a carefully written script. They owned a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, complete with a garden where the children played during warm evenings. Weekends were often spent together, picnics at nearby parks, outings to the mountains, or lazy afternoons with board games and movies. There was laughter, there was routine, and there was the kind of stability people dream of when they think about raising a family in suburban America. Emily believed that she and Michael had built something enduring, something that could weather stress, disagreements, or even occasional crises. But as with many tragedies, the warning signs started quietly. Michael began staying later at work. He excused his absences by citing important cases or demanding clients. At first, Emily didn't question it. She admired her husband's ambition and believed in supporting his career, just as he had supported hers. But the changes didn't stop there. Michael grew distant at home. He no longer suggested their evening walks or volunteered to help with the children's bedtime routines. He seemed distracted, often lost in thought, as though part of him was living elsewhere. Emily told herself this was temporary, perhaps just a stressful season at the firm. She tried harder to create a warm atmosphere at home, preparing his favorite meals, encouraging family game nights, and being patient with his silences. But even her efforts couldn't erase the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The distance between them was no longer occasional, it had become a pattern. Michael's behavior escalated into secrecy. He began guarding his phone, carrying it with him even into the bathroom, something he had never done before. He traveled on weekends, claiming urgent business trips. When Emily asked cautious questions, he reassured her with a smile and a practiced calmness that made her doubt her own instincts. "You worry too much," he would say. "Everything is fine. I'm just tired." Those words comforted her briefly, but each time the comfort faded faster. In these moments of doubt, Emily turned to her mother for advice. Linda had always been her anchor, the one person she could confide in without fear of judgment. Emily poured out her anxieties, her fear that Michael was slipping away, her confusion over his sudden changes, her hope that things would somehow return to normal. Linda listened carefully, offering gentle words of reassurance. Emily clung to this maternal support, believing that with time and patience, her marriage would survive. What Emily did not know was that the person she trusted most, the one she leaned on for comfort, was the very person who was betraying her behind closed doors. The truth emerged not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the most ordinary of moments. One quiet Saturday morning, Emily was alone in the house. Michael had left early, claiming work obligations, and the children were spending the weekend with Linda. Emily stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee, the silence of the house surrounding her. Then, suddenly, Michael's phone lit up on the counter. It was a simple notification, but the sender's name froze her in place: Linda. The message preview displayed only a few words, but those words would change everything. "I can't wait to see you again." Emily's heart pounded. She felt her stomach drop, as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. Her first instinct was denial. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, a message taken out of context. But something in her gut told her otherwise. She reached for the phone, unlocked it. Michael had never hidden his passcode from her before, and began scrolling through the conversation. What she found shattered her. The messages between Michael and Linda stretched back for months. They were not casual notes about family schedules or friendly reminders. They were filled with longing, intimacy, and careful planning. Mentions of stolen moments, secret meetings, and coded phrases revealed the depth of their betrayal. Emily's mother and her husband, the two people she loved most, had been conducting an affair right under her nose. She sat in the kitchen, phone in hand, reading line after line until the tears blurred her vision. Each message was like a dagger, cutting deeper into her sense of security and identity. How could her mother, the woman who raised her, do this? How could her husband, the father of her children, break the very foundation of their marriage? That morning marked the beginning of the end. For Emily, the illusion of a stable life was gone. She was no longer simply a wife, a mother, or a teacher. She had become the central figure in a story of betrayal, secrecy, and, eventually, murder. And while she sat frozen in disbelief, the events set in motion would soon spiral far beyond her control. To understand how a seemingly ordinary suburban family could descend into betrayal and murder, we must look closely at the lives of the three central figures in this tragedy: Emily Parker, her husband Michael Parker, and her mother Linda Hayes. Their histories, personalities, and the ways they intersected set the stage for what would eventually unfold. Behind the image of a happy household lay layers of vulnerability, ambition, and unspoken tensions that, when combined, created the perfect storm. Emily Parker had always been described by friends as the embodiment of kindness. Born and raised in a modest town in Nebraska, she grew up in a household that valued education, empathy, and hard work. From a young age, she displayed a gift for teaching, often helping younger children with homework or organizing makeshift classes in her backyard during the summer. Her path to becoming an elementary school teacher seemed almost preordained. Those who knew her remembered her as someone who lit up a room, not with loudness or extravagance, but with quiet warmth and patience. When Emily moved to Denver for college, she was determined to build a stable life for herself. She enrolled in the education program and balanced her studies with part-time jobs to cover expenses. During this time, she met Michael Parker. Michael was everything Emily was not: bold, confident, and relentless in his pursuit of success. Where she spoke softly, he projected authority. Where she took time to listen, he was quick to persuade. Their differences, instead of driving them apart, seemed to complement one another. Emily admired his drive and determination. Michael was drawn to her sincerity and loyalty. Their relationship progressed quickly. Within a year, they were married. Friends at the time expressed surprise at how fast it all happened, but both Emily and Michael seemed certain that they were building something lasting. The early years of their marriage were filled with the typical struggles of young couples: financial strain, balancing careers, and adjusting to the demands of adulthood, but they faced those challenges together. Emily continued her journey as a teacher, and Michael climbed the ladder at a prestigious law firm. When their son Ethan was born, followed 3 years later by their daughter Chloe, Emily embraced motherhood wholeheartedly. She often told colleagues that teaching children at school was rewarding, but nothing compared to watching her own children learn, grow, and develop their personalities. She became the center of the Parker household, the one who kept routines intact, remembered birthdays, and made holidays magical. Michael, meanwhile, poured himself into his career. His reputation as a skilled attorney grew quickly. He specialized in corporate litigation, a field that required long hours, razor-sharp preparation, and the ability to argue forcefully under pressure. Colleagues described him as ambitious, charismatic, and sometimes ruthless. He was not the type to back down from a challenge, whether in the courtroom or in negotiations. His income provided the family with financial security, allowing them to buy a spacious home in a desirable neighborhood of Denver, complete with a tidy garden and a quiet street where children could ride bicycles safely. On the surface, Michael appeared to be the model provider. But those close to him noticed that his work ethic sometimes crossed into obsession. He thrived on competition and recognition, and he hated to lose control of any situation. For a man like Michael, appearances mattered deeply. He wanted to be seen as successful, respected, and in command, both professionally and personally. That desire for control would later become a dangerous weakness. The third figure in this story, Linda Hayes, played a complex role in the family dynamic. Linda had raised Emily as a single mother after her husband left during Emily's childhood. She worked long hours as a nurse to provide for her daughter, instilling in Emily a deep appreciation for resilience and sacrifice. Their bond was unusually close. Emily often said her mother was her best friend, someone she could share everything with. When Linda retired, she moved to Denver to be near Emily and her grandchildren. Her presence was initially a blessing. She babysat the children, attended school events, and was often invited for family dinners. To Emily, having her mother nearby felt like a gift. But Linda carried her own complicated history. Years of struggling as a single parent had left her craving attention, validation, and perhaps a sense of romance she felt she had missed out on. Neighbors described Linda as elegant and engaging, a woman who looked younger than her age and knew how to command a room. She was outgoing, outspoken, and not afraid to share her opinions. While Emily saw her as a source of wisdom and comfort, Michael seemed to view her differently. Some family friends later recalled noticing subtle signs, the way Michael and Linda exchanged glances that lingered just a little too long, the private conversations that ended abruptly when others walked into the room. At the time, no one thought much of it. Hindsight, however, cast those moments in a far darker light. The triangle of Emily, Michael, and Linda was not unusual in its closeness. Many families rely on grandparents for support, and many marriages involve moments of strain. But in this case, the intersection of Emily's trust, Michael's ambition, and Linda's yearning created a fault line. Each of them carried unspoken needs. Emily longed for reassurance that her marriage was solid, Michael craved validation and escape from pressure, and Linda sought intimacy and attention after years of loneliness. As months passed, these needs overlapped in ways that blurred boundaries. Emily continued to believe in the image of a perfect family, unaware that her trust was being systematically betrayed. Michael, driven by desire and perhaps the thrill of secrecy, allowed himself to cross a line he could never retreat from. And Linda, torn between maternal love and selfish impulses, became complicit in a deception that would devastate her daughter's life. Looking back, some observers pointed to small but telling signs. Emily's colleagues recalled her mentioning that Michael seemed distant, though she always added quickly, "He's just stressed." A neighbor remembered once seeing Michael arrive home late at night, only for Linda's car to leave the driveway minutes later. Another acquaintance noted how Linda sometimes spoke about Michael with admiration that sounded unusually intense for a mother-in-law. None of these moments seemed incriminating on their own. Together, they painted a picture of a family in which trust was eroding silently. By the summer of 2022, the Parker household was under strain, though Emily herself remained hopeful. She believed in working through problems, just as she and Michael had in the past. She leaned on Linda for advice more often, unaware that Linda was deeply entangled in the very issues causing Emily's distress. This tragic irony, confiding in the betrayer, is one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Emily's life up to this point had been defined by love, dedication, and optimism. Michael's by ambition and control. Linda's by sacrifice and hidden longing. When these forces collided, the results were catastrophic. To understand why events spiraled the way they did, one must grasp not only the facts but also the fragile human psychology beneath them. Emily trusted too much. Michael feared losing everything. Linda allowed desire to override loyalty. This background is not just context, it is the foundation of the crime itself. Without it, the betrayal that followed might seem inexplicable. With it, the story becomes a haunting lesson in how ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary darkness, darkness that waits, silently, until the moment it finally comes to light. The silence of the house had once been a rare and cherished commodity. Now, it was a presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the familiar sounds of life. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the echoes of conversations that ended too abruptly. For months, this silence had been growing, colonizing the spaces between Emily and her husband, Michael. The cracks in their marriage hadn't appeared with a dramatic schism, but as a series of hairline fractures, so subtle at first that to acknowledge them felt like an overreaction, a manifestation of some insecurity she was supposed to have outgrown. It began with his time. Time, once a shared resource, became his alone. The late nights at the office, once an occasional necessity, bled into a routine. Just closing a big deal, he'd say, his voice frayed with a convincing weariness over the phone. It'll all be worth it soon. Weekend plans, the sacred territory of their family life, became provisional, then frequently canceled. A child's soccer game missed for a last-minute conference call. A promised date night postponed because a client flew in unexpectedly. She had accepted these explanations, filed them away under the heading of ambition. She was married to a successful man, and this was the price of that success. It was a story she told herself so often it had begun to feel like the truth. Then there was the phone. That sleek black monolith had become a third party in their relationship, an extension of his body. It lay face down on the nightstand, a silent accusation. It accompanied him to the bathroom. It buzzed with notifications he would angle his body to shield from her view. When she once casually asked who was texting so late, he had snapped, his response disproportionately sharp. "It's just work, Emily. Do you have to question everything?" The sting of his words had pushed her back, making her feel like a trespasser in her own marriage. She had retreated, convincing herself that her suspicion was the real problem, not his secrecy. She was being needy, paranoid. She had to be more understanding. This particular Saturday morning, the silence was absolute. Michael had left before sunrise, something about an early meeting with international partners, a detail that felt both impressive and conveniently unverifiable. Their children, Noah and Sophie, were with her mother, Linda, for a precious grandma's weekend. The house should have been a sanctuary for Emily, a space to recharge. Instead, it felt like a stage, empty and waiting for a drama to unfold. She stood in the kitchen, the soft gray morning light filtering through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, usually a comfort, did little to soothe the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was performing normalcy, going through the motions of a peaceful weekend morning. It was a fragile illusion, and it was about to be shattered. On the granite countertop, nestled beside the fruit bowl, lay Michael's phone. He must have forgotten it in his rush. A rare oversight. She stared at it, a cold dread coiling within her. It was a Pandora's box she had long resisted opening. Her gaze drifted away, towards the coffee maker, the refrigerator covered in her children's drawings, anchors to the life she believed she had. Don't look. Just let it be. It's his private property. Trust him. The mantras felt hollow, worn thin from overuse. And then, it happened. The screen lit up, casting a stark, artificial glow across the counter. The vibration was a low, urgent hum against the stone, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up into her very bones. She froze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. It wasn't a call, just a message. But it was the name displayed above the text that made the air leave her lungs in a silent gasp. Mom. For a disorienting second, her mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was about the kids. Noah forgot his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Can you bring it by? Or perhaps, what time should I have them ready for pickup tomorrow? It had to be something mundane, something maternal. Her mother was her confidant, her staunchest ally, the co-keeper of her family's history. But her body knew before her mind did. The slight tremor in her hands, the sudden iciness of her blood. She set her mug down with exaggerated care, the ceramic clinking loudly in the stillness. She walked towards the counter as if wading through deep water. The message preview was short, a single line of text visible on the lock screen. 6 words that would dismantle her world. I can't wait to see you again. The words hung in the air, innocent on their own, but venomous in this context. It wasn't the language of a mother to a son-in-law regarding her grandchildren. The tone was intimate, breathless with anticipation. It spoke of a recent parting and an eager reunion. A secret. Again. The word was a hammer blow, implying a history, a pattern. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was a mistake. A misunderstanding. Maybe her mother was dictating a message for a friend and it had sent to Michael by accident? Maybe her phone was acting up? Her mind, a frantic defense attorney, threw out one ludicrous theory after another. But her intuition, the detective she had been suppressing for months, was cold, clear, and certain. Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone. Her fingerprint wouldn't work, of course. It was his phone. Passcode. Her mind raced. She tried his birthday. Incorrect. Their anniversary. Incorrect. The children's birthdays, one after the other. Incorrect. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. With each failed attempt, a new wall went up between them. With one try left before the phone would be disabled, a memory surfaced. A conversation from years ago, him laughing about the simplest, most unhackable password being something you use every day. Her fingers moved stiffly, almost of their own accord. She typed in the 4 digits of their street address. The phone unlocked. The home screen appeared, a smiling photo of her and the children. A cruel, mocking facade. She felt a profound sense of violation, of crossing a boundary from which there was no return. She was no longer a wife, she was an investigator at the scene of a crime. She tapped the message icon. The thread with Mom was at the top. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a new conversation. It was a river of text, stretching back not just weeks, but months. Her eyes scanned upwards, scrolling, a reverse archaeology of her own betrayal. The recent messages were filled with a raw, desperate passion. Pet names she had never heard him use for anyone, let alone her mother. My lioness. My dearest Elle, they wrote of stolen moments, of close calls. That was too close today. Emily almost walked in. A message from Michael read. Her mother's reply, the thrill is part of the fun, my love. Just makes me want you more. Further back, the messages were more logistical, coded. References to business dinners that coincided with nights Linda was supposedly at her book club. Talk of documents to be signed which were clearly allusions to trysts at secluded hotels. She saw a reference to a small inn by the lake, a place the 4 of them had gone for a family weekend last summer. A picture formed in her mind, sickeningly clear, her and the children exploring the trails while her husband and her mother slipped away, their betrayal hidden in plain sight. The coded words, the secret language, the sheer volume of deceit, it was a meticulously constructed alternate reality. They had built a life together on the foundation of her ignorance. Every memory she held dear was now suspect, tainted by this new knowledge. That time her mother had sided with Michael in an argument, telling Emily she was being too demanding. Was it genuine advice, or was she protecting her lover? That expensive necklace Michael had given her mother for her birthday, calling it a special thank you for all her help with the kids, was it a token of gratitude, or a lover's gift? The betrayal hit her not as a single event, but as 1,000 paper cuts. It was the casual cruelty, the calculated deception by the two people in the world she was programmed to trust implicitly. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, the father of her children. And her mother. Her own mother. The woman who had held her when she cried, who had taught her how to love, who had stood beside her at her wedding and smiled. That smile was now a grotesque mask. The kitchen, once the warm heart of her home, felt alien and cold. The familiar objects on the counter, the toaster, the knife block, the children's brightly colored cups, seemed like props on a set. Her life was not real. It was a performance, and she was the only one who didn't have the script. She sank to the floor, the cool tiles a stark contrast to the fire raging inside her. The phone clattered from her numb fingers, its screen still glowing with the evidence of her shattered world. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of their lies. After Emily Parker uncovered the devastating truth about her husband and her mother, she was no longer the same woman she had been just days before. Her life, once organized around routines of teaching, parenting, and holding together the fragile threads of family, became consumed by a quiet but relentless storm. The discovery of the secret messages had lodged itself in her chest like a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every beat of her heart. And yet, outwardly, she chose not to explode. At least not yet. Emily understood something that many in her position might not. To survive betrayal, you must first know the full scope of it. That was why, instead of confronting Michael immediately, she opted for silence. She smiled when necessary, asked about his day, and kissed her children goodnight as though nothing had changed. But each night, after Michael fell asleep, she would reach for his phone and scroll through message after message. Every word confirmed what she already knew. Her husband and her mother were entangled in a web of intimacy that was both shocking and grotesque. The secrecy of her actions took a toll on her. Emily had always been a transparent person, someone who valued honesty and communication. Now, she lived with a mask, hiding her torment behind rehearsed smiles. To her colleagues at school, she was still Miss Parker, the warm teacher who encouraged her students and celebrated small victories. To her neighbors, she was the friendly woman who waved from the yard. But behind the closed door of her bedroom, she was unraveling. Michael, on the other hand, began to sense that something had shifted. He was not blind to the change in Emily's demeanor. Her laughter came less often. Her gaze lingered on him longer, but not with affection, with a searching intensity that unsettled him. She avoided unnecessary physical contact, retreating into a polite distance. At first, Michael rationalized these changes as stress, fatigue, or perhaps a phase of disconnection that many couples experienced. But deep down, a flicker of fear took hold. It wasn't only Emily who was unraveling. Linda, too, grew restless. The older woman sensed her daughter's withdrawal, the hesitations in her voice when they spoke, the way Emily now avoided long visits. Linda suspected that Emily had begun to piece things together, and this suspicion tightened the coil of tension between mother and daughter. Conversations became shorter, more cautious, as though each woman was testing the other without admitting what she knew or feared. Inside the Parker household, this invisible tension thickened with each passing day. Emily rehearsed in her mind what she might say when the confrontation finally came. She imagined scenarios, yelling, demanding answers, or even walking out with the children. But the weight of the betrayal made clarity elusive. Her husband had betrayed her. Her mother had betrayed her. The two people she loved most had formed an alliance in secrecy. It was not just infidelity, it was a complete erosion of trust, a tearing apart of identity itself. Michael, meanwhile, was juggling dual lives, and the pressure was mounting. With Emily, he performed the role of husband, discussing school schedules and grocery lists. With Linda, he played the part of secret lover, sneaking messages, planning stolen moments. Maintaining both performances became increasingly exhausting. He lived in constant fear of exposure, and every small change in Emily's behavior heightened that fear. When she was quiet at dinner, he wondered if she knew. When she avoided eye contact, he imagined she had already spoken to someone. At work, Michael began to lose his edge. Colleagues noticed he was distracted, sometimes staring blankly in meetings or fumbling details he normally handled with precision. The weight of guilt, combined with paranoia, chipped away at his composure. He began drinking more heavily in the evenings, pouring whiskey into a glass before bed as a way to numb the gnawing anxiety inside him. For Emily, the silence was suffocating. The longer she kept the secret to herself, the heavier it became. Yet she also feared what would happen if she spoke. Confronting Michael meant detonating the fragile facade of normalcy that shielded her children. Confronting Linda meant severing the bond she had cherished since childhood. Each day that passed without confrontation was a day she convinced herself she was preserving stability for Ethan and Chloe. But each day also brought her closer to the breaking point. The children themselves became unknowing witnesses to the growing rift. Ethan asked why his parents didn't laugh as much as before. Chloe, too young to articulate, clung more tightly to her mother, sensing the change in atmosphere. Emily shielded them as best she could, maintaining routines of bedtime stories and weekend outings. But even children can feel when something is wrong, and the Parker home had begun to vibrate with an unspoken dread. One evening, Emily sat alone in the kitchen long after the children were asleep. She stared at Michael's phone, once again open in her hand, and scrolled through messages that had by now become familiar. The words no longer shocked her, they merely confirmed the betrayal she lived with daily. But that night, something different happened. Michael came downstairs unexpectedly and caught her with the phone in her hand. His face hardened as their eyes met. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone sharp. Emily quickly placed the phone on the counter. "Nothing," she replied, her voice steady but her pulse racing. Michael's eyes narrowed. He didn't press further, but the suspicion was planted. From that moment on, the balance of silence began to tilt. Emily knew that Michael was watching her more closely. Michael, in turn, suspected that Emily had glimpsed the truth. Neither said it out loud, but the knowledge hung between them, unspoken and dangerous. In the weeks that followed, this silent standoff grew unbearable. Michael became increasingly irritable, snapping over trivial matters. Emily withdrew further, choosing avoidance over conflict. Linda, sensing the storm, attempted to keep her distance, but her very absence only fueled Emily's determination to one day demand answers. By mid-July, the household was a powder keg. Emily's patience had stretched to its limits. Every time she looked at Michael, she saw not her husband but her betrayer. Every phone call from Linda felt like salt in a wound. Her silence, once a shield, had become a prison. She knew the confrontation was inevitable. She also knew, in the depths of her heart, that it would not end peacefully. The escalation of tension was no longer hidden. It was written in Emily's strained smiles, in Michael's restless pacing, in the tightness of their voices when they spoke to one another. The facade of the perfect suburban family had cracked wide open. What remained was a household simmering with betrayal, resentment, and dread. And as with all powder kegs, it was only a matter of time before the spark arrived. The Parker household reached its breaking point on a warm evening in mid-July. By then, weeks of silence, suspicion, and unspoken truths had twisted the air into something heavy and unbearable. What had once been a home filled with children's laughter and family dinners had become a stage for tension so thick that even the smallest glance or word could ignite it. And on July 16, 2022, the spark finally came. That day began like any other, deceptively ordinary. Emily woke early, prepared breakfast for Ethan and Chloe, and kissed them goodbye as she dropped them off at a friend's house for a sleepover. She had planned it that way, deliberately ensuring the children would be absent that night. In her heart, she knew the confrontation she had been postponing could no longer wait. Her silence had become poison, eating away at her from the inside. The evidence she had gathered, the texts, the patterns, the lies, left no doubt. It was time for Michael to face the truth. Michael, meanwhile, came home that evening visibly tense. His shoulders were stiff, his eyes darting nervously as he entered the house. He sensed Emily had grown colder, and deep down he feared the silence was about to erupt. Yet, even in his unease, he clung to the hope that the facade might somehow hold. He poured himself a drink, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to lose himself in news headlines on his tablet. Emily busied herself with dinner. The clatter of dishes and the smell of roasting vegetables filled the kitchen, but beneath it all was a suffocating silence. Neither of them spoke more than a few words, each waiting for the other to break. To an outsider, it might have looked like any ordinary evening. But inside Emily's chest, her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. Tonight, she would finally speak. When the children were away and the house was quiet, Emily set down her dish towel, turned toward Michael, and said the words she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. Her voice was steady, though it carried the weight of weeks of torment. "We need to talk." Michael looked up slowly, his brow furrowing. "About what?" he asked, feigning ignorance. But his hand tightened around the edge of the tablet, betraying his nerves. Emily's eyes locked onto his. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the words still came out like a blow. "I know, Michael. I know about you and my mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face drained of color. For a moment, he didn't move, as though frozen in place. Then the tablet slipped from his hands and landed on the table with a dull thud. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Emily continued, her voice shaking but resolute. "I've seen the messages. All of them. You lied to me, you betrayed our family, and you let this go on right under my nose. How could you?" Michael raised his hands, as if to slow her down, his voice breaking as he stammered, "Emily, it's not what you think. You're overreacting." "Don't," she cut him off sharply. "Don't insult me with more lies. I've read everything. I know exactly what you've been doing." The weight of her words hung in the room like smoke. Michael lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. In that instant, the mask he had worn for months began to crumble. Fear coursed through him, fear not only of losing Emily but of losing everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his standing in the community. Emily, her body trembling, turned away. She needed air. Stepping through the sliding door, she walked into the backyard, the night air cool against her flushed skin. She stood under the stars, her chest rising and falling as she tried to calm the storm raging inside her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to call someone, but all she could do was stand there, breathing in the dark silence of the suburban night. Inside, Michael was unraveling. Panic flooded his mind. Images of his future, his colleagues whispering, the firm dropping him, neighbors pointing fingers, his children growing up knowing the truth, played like a reel he couldn't shut off. Shame collided with anger, and the combination was volatile. He told himself he had no options left, that Emily's discovery had destroyed everything. He convinced himself that she would tell the world that his downfall was inevitable. And in that spiral of paranoia and rage, his thoughts turned violent. Michael slid the door open and stepped into the yard. His figure loomed behind Emily, who did not yet sense the danger. He called her name softly, but when she turned, the look on his face was something she had never seen before, a mixture of fear, fury, and desperation. "What are you going to do, Emily?" he asked, his voice low and shaking. "Tell everyone? Ruin us? Destroy the kids' lives?" Emily's eyes narrowed. "You destroyed this family, Michael. Not me." Those words, calm yet devastating, seemed to snap something inside him. In that moment, Michael believed he had no control left, and for a man who had built his life on control, that was intolerable. What happened next would seal his fate forever. In the dark yard, away from the children and the neighbors, the confrontation turned into tragedy. By the time the night was over, Emily Parker, a mother, teacher, and daughter betrayed, would never draw breath again. The turning point had arrived. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for months had exploded in the worst possible way. And in that explosion, the Parker family's story transformed from one of betrayal to one of irreversible loss. The morning after Emily Parker's life came to a sudden and violent end, the quiet suburban street in Denver awoke to flashing lights and the low hum of police radios. Neighbors who normally waved politely while walking their dogs now stood behind curtains or gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, whispering about what they had seen, or, more accurately, what they hadn't seen, the night before. The Parker home, once another indistinguishable part of the neighborhood's tranquility, had become a crime scene. Detective Rachel Morgan, a veteran investigator with the Denver Police Department, was among the first to arrive. Known for her meticulous attention to detail and calm presence, she had seen her share of tragedies. Yet, as she stepped through the gate and into the Parkers' backyard, she immediately felt the weight of what she was about to unravel. Emily's body lay on the cool grass, her expression frozen in the silent testimony of betrayal and suffering. The marks on her neck told the story more clearly than words ever could. Morgan crouched beside the body, her eyes scanning the immediate area. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of a prolonged struggle. To her experienced mind, this suggested a sudden attack, a burst of violence executed quickly, likely by someone Emily trusted enough to be close to without suspicion. Her instincts whispered the answer before the evidence even began to take shape. Inside the house, Michael Parker greeted officers with a strained composure. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He told the officers that he had woken early, stepped outside, and discovered his wife lying lifeless in the yard. His voice trembled as he delivered the words, yet there was something mechanical in his tone, as though he were reciting lines from a script hastily memorized. Detective Morgan studied him carefully. In her years of work, she had learned that grief rarely presented itself in the same way twice. Some widows wailed uncontrollably, others were silent and numb. But Michael's demeanor did not strike her as either. Instead, it struck her as practiced, the performance of a man trying to appear devastated while holding something back. "Mr. Parker," she began gently, "can you tell me where you were last night?" Michael rubbed his forehead, buying time before he answered. "I was here. After the kids went to bed, I went to my room, read for a while, and then I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up this morning, I found her, like this." His voice cracked on the last words, though his eyes remained dry. Morgan noted every detail. The avoidance of eye contact. The pause before answering. The absence of genuine emotion behind the trembling voice. None of these were proof of guilt, but they were pieces of a puzzle she had put together countless times before. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing the scene, collecting fibers, and swabbing for trace evidence. They confirmed what Morgan suspected: the cause of death was strangulation. That detail alone narrowed the possibilities. Strangulation, unlike other forms of violence, requires proximity and time. It is rarely the act of a stranger in the night. It is intimate, deliberate, and deeply personal. As news of Emily's death spread, neighbors came forward with observations. One couple recalled hearing muffled voices late at night, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Michael pacing in the yard earlier in the evening, agitated and alone. No one had seen anyone unfamiliar near the house. The investigation quickly turned inward. Detective Morgan requested access to both Michael's and Emily's phones. Emily's device, once unlocked, became a goldmine of information. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had saved dozens of messages exchanged between Michael and Linda Hayes, her mother. The tone of those conversations left little to the imagination: longing, secrecy, and coded references to encounters that could not be explained away as innocent. For Morgan, the case began to crystallize. The motive was clear: Emily had discovered the affair between her husband and her mother. The opportunity was undeniable: Michael had been at home with her the night she died. The means were consistent: his physical strength compared to Emily's slight frame made the act tragically feasible. When confronted with the messages, Michael's facade began to crack. He initially denied any wrongdoing, insisting the relationship with Linda was misunderstood and taken out of context. But as detectives pressed, presenting not only the text history but also forensic evidence, traces on his clothing that matched fibers from Emily's nightwear, microscopic skin cells under her nails consistent with defensive contact, his resistance faltered. Days into the interrogation, Morgan leaned across the table, her voice calm but firm. "Michael, The truth is already here. The only thing left is whether you choose to say it yourself." At first, he stared at the table, silent. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She found out. She was going to ruin everything. My career, my reputation, the kids. She threatened to tell everyone. I didn't know what to do. I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was over, that she couldn't forgive me. And I lost control." With those words, the investigation reached its turning point. Michael Parker's confession, combined with the mountain of evidence, left little room for doubt. He admitted to grabbing Emily in the backyard during the argument, to letting his fear and anger override reason. His description of events matched the physical evidence almost exactly, leaving the defense little ground to argue. Meanwhile, Linda Hayes was brought in for questioning. Her shock at Emily's death was convincing to some, but to Detective Morgan, it felt layered. Linda admitted to the affair with Michael, though she insisted she had no knowledge of his intent to harm Emily. She claimed that her involvement had been a terrible mistake, one she would regret forever. While morally abhorrent, her actions did not meet the threshold of criminal liability. She was not charged in connection with Emily's death, though her reputation and relationship with her grandchildren were destroyed beyond repair. The case moved swiftly through the courts. The prosecution painted Michael as a man whose ambition and fear of exposure drove him to silence the one person who could reveal his secret. They presented his confession, the digital correspondence, and the forensic evidence in stark detail. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, that Michael had acted in a moment of panic, not premeditation. But the jury saw through it. After a brief deliberation, they found him guilty of second-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of 55 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom, heavy with silence, absorbed the weight of the decision. Michael sat motionless as the gavel fell, his once confident demeanor reduced to that of a broken man facing the consequences of his own choices. For Emily's family and friends, the verdict brought a measure of justice but little comfort. 2 children had lost their mother forever, and their father to a prison cell. Linda, the grandmother who might have been their caretaker, was estranged, consumed by guilt and social exile. What remained of the Parker family was a shell of what it had once been, the echo of betrayal, violence, and grief. Detective Rachel Morgan, filing her final report, summarized it simply: "This case illustrates the devastating consequences of secrecy and betrayal within families. The victim's trust was exploited by those closest to her. The resulting tragedy underscores the vulnerability that exists when love is replaced by deceit." The investigation had revealed not only the mechanics of a crime but the collapse of a family from the inside out. And while Michael Parker would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the true sentence was borne by the innocent Ethan and Chloe, who would grow up carrying the shadows of a night they were spared from witnessing, but whose impact would follow them forever. The trial of Michael Parker closed a chapter in the courts, but for the people left behind, it marked the beginning of a lifelong sentence of another kind. Justice, as defined by the law, had been served: a guilty verdict, a lengthy prison sentence, the promise that a killer would never again walk freely through society. Yet for the family fractured by betrayal and murder, no judge's gavel could repair what had been broken. For Emily Parker's loved ones, the aftermath unfolded slowly, painfully, and often in silence. Friends and colleagues at the elementary school where she taught gathered in grief. They remembered her as a dedicated teacher, someone who stayed after hours to help struggling students, who bought art supplies out of her own pocket, who greeted every child with the same warmth she gave her own 2 children. Her absence in the classroom left more than an empty desk; it left a void in the lives of children who had relied on her kindness and stability. The community organized a vigil in Emily's honor. Dozens of parents, students, and neighbors held candles in the fading light of dusk, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. Some cried openly. Others stood in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the image of the cheerful woman they knew with the horror of the way her life had ended. For them, the story was not just about crime but about trust in the people closest to us, and how devastating it is when that trust is shattered. For Ethan and Chloe, the consequences were even more profound. Too young to fully comprehend the complexities of betrayal, they understood only the absence of their mother and the disappearance of their father. At first, relatives shielded them from the details, speaking only in generalities about accidents and mistakes. But children sense what is unspoken. Ethan, especially, began to ask questions. Why couldn't they live in their own home anymore? Why did Grandma Linda cry so much? Why did everyone lower their voices when he entered the room? Linda Hayes, once a central figure in their lives, became a shadow of herself. Public opinion condemned her as the woman whose choices had lit the fuse on a family's destruction. Though she was never charged with a crime, her reputation collapsed. Neighbors avoided her. Former friends cut ties. The guilt she carried was heavier than any legal sentence could have been. She had not killed her daughter with her own hands, but she had played a part in the chain of events that led to Emily's death. That knowledge was an unshakable weight. Detective Rachel Morgan, in reflecting on the case, described it as one of the most haunting of her career. She had investigated gang violence, drug-related homicides, and cases of domestic abuse. But this was different. This was a family imploding from the inside, a web of betrayal that cut through the very foundation of loyalty and love. What stays with you, she told a local reporter, is not just the crime itself but the betrayal that preceded it. Emily trusted both her husband and her mother. And both of them failed her in the worst possible way. The case made headlines across Denver and beyond. News outlets ran stories dissecting the affair, the murder, and the trial. Commentators debated how a man like Michael, successful, respected, with no history of violence, could cross the line into killing his wife. Psychologists weighed in, pointing to the corrosive effects of secrecy, fear of exposure, and the fragile egos of individuals who define themselves by reputation. To many, the Parker case was not simply about one man's crime but about the hidden vulnerabilities that exist in seemingly ordinary families. In prison, Michael Parker adjusted poorly. Accustomed to control, to order, to the esteem of colleagues, he found himself reduced to an inmate number, another figure in a system he had once viewed from the outside as a lawyer. His fellow prisoners knew his story, tabloids and television had ensured that. Some taunted him, others avoided him. In rare interviews with investigators, Michael admitted to struggling with guilt, though he often couched his words in self-pity. "I lost everything," he said once, as if the tragedy were his alone. What he failed to acknowledge, at least publicly, was that his choices had taken more than just his freedom. They had stolen a mother from 2 children and left scars that would never heal. For Ethan and Chloe, therapy became a necessity. Professionals worked with them to process grief, abandonment, and confusion. Children who lose one parent to violence and the other to incarceration face a unique form of trauma. They grow up in the shadow of a crime they did not commit, carrying questions that may never fully be answered. Who will they blame when they are old enough to understand? Will they forgive? Or will they carry the weight of anger into their own adult lives? Those questions remain open, lingering like unfinished chapters in a book no one wanted to write. The Parker home, once a place of warmth, was eventually sold. Its walls, which had contained laughter, arguments, and finally tragedy, became someone else's property. For the neighborhood, it was a reminder of how fragile appearances can be. Families who had once envied the Parkers' tidy lawn and seemingly perfect life now spoke of the house in hushed tones. It was not just a house anymore, it was a cautionary symbol. The broader lesson of the Parker case extends beyond one family's collapse. It forces a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about relationships, secrecy, and the fragile nature of trust. Affairs, though sadly common, rarely escalate into murder. But when betrayal intersects with fear, pride, and desperation, the potential for violence grows. Michael Parker's downfall was not the result of a single choice but of many small ones, choosing lies over honesty, secrecy over accountability, image over reality. Emily Parker's story became a stark reminder that behind closed doors, no family is immune to darkness. She was a woman who dedicated her life to others, to her students, to her children, to her marriage, and in return she was deceived by the very people she relied upon most. Her legacy, however, is not defined by the betrayal or even the manner of her death. It is defined by the love she gave, the children she raised, and the lives she touched in her classroom and community. At the end of her report, Detective Morgan wrote words that have since been repeated in articles and forums discussing the case: "The law can deliver justice, but it cannot heal betrayal." That part is left to the survivors. For Ethan and Chloe, for the friends and colleagues who loved Emily, for a community shocked into awareness, the healing will take years, perhaps lifetimes. As the years pass, the Parker case will fade from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But for those directly affected, it will never fade. It will remain a reminder of how fragile trust is, how quickly love can be corrupted by selfishness, and how devastating the consequences of betrayal can be. In the end, the lesson is painfully simple: families are built on trust, and without it, even the strongest foundations can collapse into ruin. Emily's story warns us that secrets and lies, no matter how carefully concealed, always find their way into the light. And when they do, the cost can be far higher than anyone is prepared to pay.